So my name is Sarah Haffenden, and I'm the Marketing Communications Manager at UKZN Extended Learning, also known as UEL. So in case you're unfamiliar with UEL, we are the continuing education unit of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and we offer all the short courses on behalf of the university. So we are offering these webinars as we are in full support and compliance with the directive of a national lockdown issued to address the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're embracing the changes and have launched a number of projects aimed at providing free access to learning materials during this lockdown period. One of these projects is the online learning webinars. So this webinar forms part of a 4-part nutrition series. This is part 3. The previous webinars from this series are available on our website. And our webinars will continue throughout June on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but do take a look at our final slide at the end of this webinar for further details on upcoming webinars. Or you can visit our website at www.ukznextendedlearning.com. So in terms of the format for today, we'll go through the presentation, and throughout the presentation, you are able to ask questions in the Q&A box or raise your hand. All these questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. So if you raise your hand, we will open your mic and you can verbally ask your question. So I'd now like to introduce you to our guest speaker for today, Professor Susanna Kazia. Suna is a registered dietitian, associate professor at dietetics and human nutrition, and academic leader for teaching and learning in the School of Agricultural, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Prior to joining UKZN in 2007, she was a senior lecturer at DUT for 13 years, a senior community nutrition dietitian with the Department of Health for 3 years, and a senior clinical dietitian at Tygerberg Hospital in Cape Town for 3 years. She holds a PhD in nutrition and dietetics from the University of Cape Town, a master's in dietetics from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, a Bachelor of Science Honours in Dietetics, and a postgraduate diploma in Hospital Dietetics, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Dietetics from Stellenbosch University. She has served as an invited speaker at numerous congresses and events. Her research focus includes non-communicable diseases of lifestyle, obesity, infant and young child nutrition, and food security, with publications in local and international journals. She has authored a book stemming from her passion to communicate scientific information to members of the public, and wrote a chapter for a scientific publication on the multidisciplinary management of colorectal cancer. Her biggest achievements to date are being a wife, mother, and monster-in-law. Welcome, Suna, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everybody, from a very, very cold Pietermaritzburg. So yes, the topic this morning is related to obesity and food insecurity. Food insecurity, of course, being a lack of food. And what I'm hoping to explore with you this morning is that obesity is not just related to, for instance, eating too much or being underactive. And this topic is especially of importance considering our current COVID situation and the economic changes that it has brought about within not only the South African society, but globally. So I'm just trying to change the slide here. All right, so I think as South Africans, we are all very aware of the fact that our country is very, very much sought after tourist destination due to its natural beauty. And of course, our country is very varied in terms of its landscape and various areas to visit. However, something that is worth taking note of is that our country's health profile is also extremely varied. Now, just to give you a few pointers, the prevalence of low birth weight infants is actually 14.2%. In other words, 14.2% of all infants born in South Africa weigh less than 2.5 kilograms at birth. Now, this is not related to infants that were born prematurely. It is actually infants that are born from 38 weeks of the pregnancy and onwards and weigh less than 2.5 kgs at birth. The other statistic that is also very, very so much worth of being concerned about, is that our neonatal mortality rate per 1,000 live births is 10.7. This means that in the neonatal period, in other words, in the very first couple of days after birth, 10.7 infants out of every 1,000 live births actually pass away. And then our under 5 mortality rate is 33.8. And this relates to the fact that infants and young children under the age of 5, that 33.8% of them have a risk, or it's been documented that they actually pass away before they reach their 5th birthday. Then on the other hand, we also have a big problem with obesity. So for instance, it has been estimated with certain studies that 24.7% of our school-age children, in other words, children at primary school level up to high school, 4.7% of these children are overweight. And then we have very high prevalence of obesity among South Africans, standing at 28.3%. And this is across the board. It doesn't, this figure doesn't distinguish between males and females. So just to give you an overview of our health indicators in South Africa and how the health landscape has changed across South Africa, I want to refer you to the health indicators on the left-hand side of your screen that I'm indicating with a pointer. And then if we look about 11 years later, you will see that there's been a slight change in profile. Now, communicable diseases are related to, for instance, diseases, and those are indicated with red dots, that are related to infections as well as maternal, neonatal, in other words, during early infancy, and nutritional diseases. So the HIV status as the #1 cause of premature death hasn't changed, and neither has lower respiratory tract infections. But what you can, for instance, see is, and worth noting, is that, for instance, diabetes that I've highlighted in yellow has actually moved up a couple of spots. And then TB, for instance, has actually declined in terms of being the most prevalent cause of premature death. Now, let's look at South African males, and this is related to the leading causes of death spanning from 2014 to 2016. And you'll see there, when we look at South African males, the highest prevalence of deaths is related to TB. And then please note the yellow sections that I've indicated, because you can see that there are, for instance, second on the list that I've highlighted in yellow, that you can see on your screen, is related to other forms of heart disease. And then HIV is third. But then please note the other sections highlighted in yellow, because these are all conditions that are very strongly linked to obesity. And hence it is worth noting that these are very important causes of deaths among South African males. Now, if we look at the females on the next slide, you will see the profile has changed slightly, and you can see that diabetes, cerebrovascular disease, in other words, that is related to passing away due to a stroke, other forms of heart disease and hypertension, also known as high blood pressure, are actually the most prevalent causes of death. And then you'll see TB is slightly lower, and then note there that for South African females, HIV is actually not one of the primary causes of mortality or death. So what I'm hoping to share with you then for the remainder of the presentation is just to give you a brief overview as to why the topic under discussion this morning is of importance, as well as give you an idea of the numerous causes of obesity, the first 1,000 days of life, and I will explain that concept in more detail in a few minutes, actually what then happens if you are obese, what is the outcome of that, then why is it important for us to be aware of the first 1,000 days of life, and what relationship has that to the current COVID pandemic globally, etc. And then last but not least, we are looking at a concept that has been refined over a couple of decades now, and is referred to as the developmental origins of health and disease. And you will then see that that abbreviation that I've indicated there is something that I will then use for the remainder of that part of the presentation. And then last but not least, what can we actually do to address developmental origins of health and disease? So, as I have alluded to earlier on, obesity is associated with an increased risk for developing several non-communicable diseases. So non-communicable diseases are diseases that you cannot contract from somebody else. In other words, non-communicable relates to the fact that it's not infection related. So just to remind you then that these diseases include type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a diabetes that is very strongly associated with obesity and is more likely to be something that people develop as they get older. However, with the increased prevalence of obesity amongst young and old South Africans, or older South Africans, we are starting to see a lot of type 2 diabetes amongst very young children, not even at school going age, but sometimes even younger than that. Then we alluded to the fact that coronary heart disease is important to consider, as is high blood pressure, stroke, and asthma. Now, high blood pressure is something that places you at an increased risk for having a stroke. So that is why it's so important to be aware of the fact that if one has a high blood pressure level, it should actually be, you should seek medical advice, because we would obviously want to prevent the onset of stroke. Now, if we just look at where South Africa stands in terms of the African continent, at this moment in time, it is then, if we look at the global prevalence of obesity, the figures that they indicate is that 28.3% of South African adults are obese, and the only country that surpasses us on this African continent is Egypt, and they currently stand at 36.2%. Then if we look at the African continent as a whole, 69.2% of those individuals with diabetes is actually undiagnosed, which is quite sad, because if you are undiagnosed, you can obviously not be treated. Then a 77% of the mortality, or otherwise known as death rate, due to diabetes occurs amongst those individuals younger than 60 years of age. And that is something that is also worth taking note of, because if you pass away and you are under the age of 60, it is very, very young. Then type 2 diabetes, the one that is strongly related to obesity, actually makes up more than 90% of the diabetes cases in Africa. And type 1 diabetes, just to bring you into the picture, is a type of diabetes that is more related to genetics, and individuals with type 1 diabetes, which is not our topic of concern this morning, is something that has its onset at a much younger age, generally speaking. And those individuals very often start off on insulin injections right from the moment they are diagnosed. So the type 1 diabetes has a genetic component, whereas type 2 diabetes is very, very strongly related to being overweight and or obese. And then in South Africa, we don't have very, very clear statistics on exactly how many South Africans suffer from diabetes, but it is at this stage estimated to be about 5.4% of our population. And then you can just see there the number of cases. Now, the causes of obesity are multifactorial. In other words, there's much more to becoming obese than just eating too much or being underactive, or a combination of those two factors. So just to give you an idea, I've just tried to summarize and give you an overview of the complexity of being obese. But for the purpose of our presentation and interaction this morning, I'm especially focusing on the antenatal period. And the antenatal period then is what actually happens while the fetus is in utero, as it's stated. Now, in other words, that is what is happening while a woman is pregnant. In other words, what are the factors that happen there before this infant is even born that can already predispose this infant to becoming obese later in life and so forth. So then looking at the generally more well-known causes of obesity, obesity is then generally the result of an energy imbalance. In other words, your energy intake is much more than your energy expenditure, or in other words, what your body requires for bodily functions. But just please note then that obesity is something that develops over a considerable period of time. So it's not something, for instance, like your weight actually followed you into the shower last night. It takes, for most individuals that are obese, it is a lifestyle that resulted in weight gain over an extended period of time. And then, as I've alluded to, that there are many complex and diverse factors that result in this positive energy balance that causes individuals to gain weight. And it's not only a matter of there being many factors, but these factors are also interrelated. And therefore, it's not as simple as saying that, for instance, somebody is underactive and they gained weight, or that they ate too much and then they gained weight. It is, for many individuals, a bit more complicated than that. So this leads us to the first 1,000 days of life. And just to put you into the picture, if we talk about the first 1,000 days, this is something that is receiving a lot of attention globally. And it's the time that actually spans roughly between conception and a child's second birthday. In other words, we start counting those days from the moment an infant is conceived. And many women don't even know that they are pregnant until they are quite far into their pregnancy. And that is something that you will see later on is also something for that it's a cause for concern, because had we known that that woman was pregnant, interventions could have actually been implemented at a very early stage of the pregnancy. So the importance of these first 1,000 days is that it presents a unique, you can see it as a window of opportunity to lay a foundation for optimum health, growth, and very importantly, neurodevelopment, in other words, brain development. So what happens during the first 1,000 days of life? There is then a substantial level of brain development. In other words, there are, an infant is born and is stimulated and is exposed to various aspects that contribute to brain development. But when it comes to the actual development of the brain in terms of its composition, from a physiological perspective, the development in utero is significant. Then this is just a rule of thumb, but generally during the first 1,000 days of life, in other words, if we count up until a young child is 2 years of age, by 2, it is generally thought that a child would have attained 50% of its adult height. Now, yes, there are genetic variations, but this is just a rule of thumb to give you an idea of how critical this these first 1,000 days are, and why a positive environment in terms of nutrition and caring of young children is so important. So the first 1,000 days are also a critical period for organ-specific structural changes. You have an altering of body composition. And if we talk about body composition, we're talking about the fact that what is the muscle to fat ratio in a young child's body. And then very importantly, also an altering of metabolism. Metabolism is related to the efficacy with which your body utilizes nutrients or energy. And then there are also a lot of other mechanisms that regulate body functions that can be altered during this critical period. And the problem is that any deficit and excesses encountered during this period is very difficult to overcome. So you can really view it as during the first 1,000 days of life, a child or a fetus for that matter is actually programmed in order to and that will actually affect the young child's health for quite a while to come. So if we then look at the first 1,000 days and why this is so important, especially in developing countries, as you, I'm sure, are very much aware, at this moment in time due to COVID, poverty has been exacerbated. So if a child grows up in an environment where there's poverty and the child becomes malnourished, and in this case we're talking about undernutrition, it also weakens the foundation formed during the first 1,000 days of life. And then we will find that because of poverty and malnutrition, during the first 1,000 days of life, children have a greater likelihood of dying early. And also, not only that, but it already programs this young child to possibly have an earlier mortality in adulthood. In other words, if changes happen during this very crucial stage of a child's development, the child is already set for suffering from especially non-communicable diseases of lifestyle that can lead to earlier death than what otherwise would have been the circumstances. And then it also sets the scene for significant morbidities. Now, morbidity is related to the prevalence of disease, whereas mortality is related to death rate. So during the first 1,000 days of life, if a child is very malnourished, the child is more prone to infections. We already alluded to the fact that there are very important and significant neurodevelopmental aspects happening during the first 1,000 days. And what then happens, for instance, is if an infant is born with a low birth weight, it doesn't only relate to the weight per se, but the fact that that infant's brain is underdeveloped. And that unfortunately leads to a whole ripple effect because that deficit in brain development is not something that can be caught up in the long run. So the child actually starts life at a great disadvantage. And then, as I've alluded to, we then also have the fact that these children that are exposed to malnutrition, especially while the mother is pregnant, it will set the scene or the stage for later onset of obesity, diabetes, and other chronic diseases, like, for instance, high blood pressure and heart disease. So now this slide is quite busy, but I just wanted to give you an overview of all the concepts and the long-term outcomes that happens during the fetal development and what actually is related to infant nutrition per se. So on the left-hand side here, we are obviously made up, and who we are and what we are is related to our genetic makeup, which we inherit from our parents. But there is then, during the fetal period, there can be a very strong relationship between the infant's genetic makeup and the nutritional environment that the fetus is exposed to. And then you can also see that the infant's genetic makeup also very strongly is affected by infection and other epigenetic factors. So in the short term, we touched on brain development being affected, and also the child's body composition in terms of what is the ratio of fat to muscle, and also bone growth. And then metabolic programming would then be related to the fact that the child or the fetus is in fact already programmed in utero regarding its ability to process nutrients like carbohydrates, which is what CHO stands for, lipids and proteins, and also very many other regulatory mechanisms like hormones, receptors for various substances or aspects, and also the child's genetic makeup. And then in the long term, what would then happen is that if the child's brain development is hampered or not optimal, it can affect the child's cognitive capacity, their level of education, or their ability to reach that which they, under other circumstances, would have been able to achieve from a cognitive perspective. And it can also then affect, for instance, culture, etc. And then what I also want you to notice here is that there's a two-way road or a highway here between the child's body composition and immunity. Locomotion refers to the child's ability to move around and reach their various developmental goals. And then in adult life, also work capacity. Because if your body isn't strong, your ability to conduct physical work would also be impaired. And then regarding the metabolic programming that I referred to, this would then impact on, for instance, energy stores for survival, whether you are exposed to an environment where food is plentiful, which is referred to as feast day, or famine. In other words, you grow up or you function in the long run in an environment where food is always in short supply. And then very importantly, the metabolic programming that happens here during utero, I apologize for switching the screen, that could actually result in insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is the precursor for developing diabetes. And then you can see on the right-hand side here, you will then see the child's ability to attain optimal performance at school, etc., will be affected. The long-term earning capacity would be affected because of hampering on cognitive development. And then also the individual would be more prone to infections. Stunting, which is actually an indicator of long-term malnutrition, refers to the fact that a child is shorter than what they are genetically supposed to be able to achieve. So yes, a child's height or an adult's height is very much linked to the genetic makeup or the genetics that they inherited from their parents. But if an infant, and in this case a fetus as well, is exposed to a very adverse environment while in utero, it can actually contribute to stunting in the long run. So we end up having adults that are shorter than what they actually would have been under other circumstances. We touched on the lower income at the top already, but just to reiterate that. And then you can see here, we have a whole combination of non-communicable diseases that are then related to this metabolic programming here that actually happens in utero if the fetus develops in an environment where nutrients are scarce. So I'm not going to go into this slide into too much detail, but just to show you again that obesity, once the individual is obese, it predisposes that individual to a wide variety of disorders. We, for instance, touched on at the top there, type 2 diabetes, but you can see there's a whole lot of other conditions and diseases that come into play that we are not going to go into too much detail for the purpose of this presentation. Now, if we look at the first 1,000 days of life and the COVID situation that is experienced globally, there's some very sobering thoughts coming from the Food and Agricultural Organization, because as it stands, in other words, pre-COVID, we already had 239 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that were undernourished. And then if you look at the number of countries that need food assistance across the African continent, it actually makes up 34 out of all other countries globally that need food assistance in order to stay afloat as such. So what we're just saying is, of the countries globally that are in need of food assistance to assist or prevent people from going hungry, the African continent makes up a very large percentage of those countries that require food assistance. Then Africa also has the highest level of food insecurity at 27%. And this is a figure that is calculated by the Food Insecurity Experience Scale. So it's just a measure to determine across countries what the prevalence of food insecurity is. So that's also a sobering figure to look at. And then unfortunately, the continent has made the least progress in reducing the prevalence of stunting. In other words, that is what I referred to previously, namely that children are exposed to chronic malnutrition over an extended period of time, and hence they do not grow in height the way they should. And Africa then accounts for, you can see there, nearly 55% of the global prevalence of stunted children. And those were figures that were documented in 2018. Now, if we then take things a step further, there are many countries in Africa where the GDP, or gross domestic profit, is very, very low. And therefore, it doesn't make a significant contribution to curbing undernutrition, because the country's available resources are already so limited. However, the Food and Agricultural Organization predicted that if we experience a recession of -1%, it will add another 30 million hungry people per year in sub-Saharan Africa alone. And depending on the extent of the recession, as well as the magnitude and the duration thereof, we can actually only see these figures increasing significantly. So that is most definitely cause for concern. And we can just imagine then extrapolating those figures to our own country, how many people will suffer from hunger and malnutrition, depending on the economy and what will happen to the economy as time goes by. So then if we look at the concept of developmental origins of health and disease, low and middle income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, are experiencing a very rapid increase in the prevalence of non-communicable diseases. But the important factor then here is that this rapid increase in these non-communicable diseases cannot fully be explained by concepts such as urbanization and the associated traditional risk factors. So yes, we know that people are increasingly flocking to urban areas and cities to seek food and to seek employment, but the changes in eating habits and lifestyle that are associated with urbanization by itself cannot actually account for this tremendous surge in non-communicable diseases we are seeing in sub-Saharan Africa. And then, of course, with urbanization, we also then get additional risk factors apart from a change in eating habits, also an increase in smoking, excessive alcohol consumption. And because the availability of motorized transport is greater, people then become increasingly inactive. But then the point here is that we cannot explain these changes just by looking at that shopping list of factors that are associated with urbanization. So if we then take the concept of the developmental origins of health and disease slightly further, just to give you an idea that over the past couple of decades, this concept has been refined. And initially in the early 90s, it was referred to as the fetal origins of adult disease. And what it relates to, and what was postulated at the time, is that exposure to certain environmental factors during critical periods of fetal development actually predisposes that fetus, and then once that infant is born, to adversities in terms of development and growth. So this thing has a significant impact on both short as well as long-term health. And that is then, at the time in the 90s, was then postulated to make a significant contribution to the long-term risk of developing non-communicable diseases. So then, as I alluded to, the environment in utero contributes to the risk of developing non-communicable diseases later in life. And the important thing then here is that these environmental factors can affect the development of the next generation as such. In other words, what we are saying is that during a mother's pregnancy, what the mother is exposed to already has a major impact on her offspring. And they actually take this even a step backwards, because they refer to the fact that it's even before conception takes place. In other words, if the mother before conceiving was already malnourished, she already is set to be more prone to having an infant with a low birth weight, etc. And then, of course, once the infant is born, this whole problem actually just exacerbates itself. So the increased risk then for developing of non-communicable diseases is then passed on from one generation to the next, because, as I alluded to earlier on, in utero, the fetus is then already exposed to various biological mechanisms, and it's that change the fetal makeup, if you wish to refer to it like that. So it's not just the genetics that the fetus inherited from both parents, but the fact that the genetic material as such is altered or affected by mechanisms that take place during pregnancy. So if we then look at the impact of this concept, especially in low and middle income countries, we need to then just remind ourselves that low and middle income countries are very much at risk for a very high prevalence of poverty, malnutrition, and if that's not enough, conditions like poor sanitation also contributes to disease, and the whole environment is just conducive to more infections occurring and individuals being exposed to infections. So if we then also look at the developing fetus in the uterine environment, apart from the fact that the mother might not actually be getting sufficient nutrients and food while she's pregnant, the mother's exposure to infections, chemicals, and other metabolic and hormonal stresses also causes a lot of physiological mechanisms to start happening. And these are actually referred to as the development of predictive adaptive responses. And this is generally abbreviated as PARS. Now, just going back to the hormonal stresses, for instance, to give you an idea, if the mother is pregnant in an environment where she is exposed to extreme emotional stress, for instance, physical abuse, etc., it means that, for instance, her adrenaline levels are higher as opposed to a mother who is pregnant in a more stable environment. And that, in addition to the fact that the mother is not getting sufficient food, already then also impacts on fetal development. And then what happens is, in relation to all these factors, the body then actually starts a cascade of various adaptive responses that is trying to cope with this extremely stressful environment that the fetus is exposed to. So if we then look at these adaptive responses, they not only support the immediate viability of the fetus. In other words, this whole cascade of events is not just to ensure that the fetus during development can reach the best possible potential for optimal development, but it also programs this fetus, and therefore infant, once it's born, to deal with a similar environment encountered later in life. So now, if we look at what the status here is in terms of similar environment, if the fetus is exposed to a lack of nutrition during in utero, the body now actually adapts, and it starts programming this fetus so that once that child is born, the child's body is now equipped to deal with a similar environment of lack of food, etc. So you can see it's already now starting to have long-term effects. And in this process, genes are stimulated or suppressed to actually adapt to expected future environments. But we actually don't know at that stage then what the expected future environments are. We only know that the fetus is programmed to cope with a similar environment to that which it was exposed to while the mother was pregnant. Future environments could then be shaped by exposure to the current environment when development conditioning mechanisms were more active. However, you will see now, if we look at other environments, that will then also become quite problematic. So if these inappropriate coping mechanisms are then put into action to meet this vulnerable time during fetal development, the risk of disease later in life is greater due to all these various hormonal and other mechanisms that actually start kicking in. So for instance, if the fetus is exposed to a lack of nutrition, it already results in insulin resistance. Now, if a fetus is exposed to a lack of nutrition, insulin resistance, which is the forerunner of developing diabetes, can be an advantage both before and after birth, because it simply means then that the body is being very thrifty in utilizing the blood glucose that is available. Because insulin is the hormone that actually unlocks the cell door for glucose to go from the bloodstream and into cells. So to help the fetus to develop optimally, that is a good thing. But then in the long run, once the infant is born, it actually then sets up a scene for increasing disease risk based on the environment that the child or adult will be living in. So the short-term adaptations by the fetus then include the downregulation of endocrine and metabolic functions, and that is then what I refer to here, where we spoke about insulin resistance. But it also then refers to specific organ functions to actually slow down growth rate to match the supply of nutrients in utero. In other words, the body of the fetus is now being programmed to cope with the limited amount of nutrients it is receiving. So during utero, what the mother ingests actually then matches that which the fetus is able to develop with or cope with. The problem, however, then is that in the long term, we have subtle irreversible changes that can happen in the development, the structure and function of some tissues and vital organs. And you can see there, what is especially worth noting there is the pancreas, because the pancreas is the organ which releases insulin. And insulin then, as alluded to earlier on, is what actually regulates our ability to make use of the glucose in our bloodstream. And then you might then find that the long-term subtle changes that happen also occur due to disruptions in gene expression. In other words, the genes' functionality as such, as well as cell differentiation. In other words, a cell developing and then actually being destined to fulfill a particular function. And then also you can see not only in the cells differentiation, but also in the production of cells. So that is affected. But however, if the individual then grows up in an environment that is the reverse of that was experienced in utero, we then develop a mismatch and a poorer fit to all these changes that happened here. So this is now where, for instance, urbanization comes in, because the infant grew up in an environment starved of, or developed in an environment starved of nutrients. But now if the young child and adult then ends up moving to an environment where food is more freely available, and this is then where we might talk about concepts like urbanization. So food is more freely available, in addition to physical activity being less. The body is still programmed to actually deal with the environment of famine. But now as an adult, the individual is exposed to an environment of feast or relative feast as such. And that is then an additional reason why adults are then predisposed to a high risk of developing certain non-communicable diseases of lifestyle, which is that abbreviation there. And then the risk is further worsened by an excessive weight gain in the postnatal period and in adult life. And I have shown you the obesity statistics in our own country as well as sub-Saharan Africa. So during this period of development in utero, we then, just to recap, have irreversible changes to tissue structure and physiology, and that actually happens to help the fetus survive and cope with the adversities that it's experiencing in utero. And this is also referred to as programming. Now, this programming that happens is very much dependent on the nature and the point at which the exposure to these insults or adversities occurs, because tissues mature at different rates and at different time points. So if you look at the figure here at the bottom, you can see if we start from conception and we follow it through right up until the infant is born, there are various stages then, and depending on at which stage the fetus is exposed to a lack of nutrition, it has specific long-term impacts on fetal development and what will happen to that child once it's born, and how it's being set up for metabolic changes from infancy right into adulthood. This slide is just to show you that, for instance, if we look at fetal development from conception right through until birth, and it also refers to what I referred to earlier on about the whole issue of brain development. So you can see, like, within, as of week 3 during fetal development, the central nervous system has already started developing, and the purple areas show you the most crucial stages for this development. And the pink areas then shows that it's the development of the system or aspect of the body composition is starting to taper off. So here you see the central nervous system taking up a very large portion of the gestation period. Then you can see the heart develops also very early for obvious reasons, and so forth. And therefore, you can then see, depending on where during this period of gestation these insults, as it's referred to, takes place, it will then have a profound effect on fetal development with long-term, far-reaching consequences. So if undernutrition of the mother occurs too soon after conception, there would be a slowdown of fetal growth, and then the mother will give birth to an infant with a low birth weight, which I reminded you earlier on is less than 2.5 kgs. But just again to remember that this 2.5 kg watershed or indicator is not related to women that gave birth prematurely for whichever reason. We're talking here about an infant where the mother actually carried the fetus for 38 weeks and onwards, and then gave birth, and then the infant ended up having a low birth weight. Now, if the undernutrition occurs during mid-pregnancy, you have altered placental development. In other words, the placenta does not work as efficiently as it should in delivering nutrients to the fetus. And then we have fetal wasting. In other words, this relates to the fact that the fetus is not gaining sufficient weight for actually the remainder of the pregnancy. And you also then find that this will result in metabolic phenotypes in adulthood. Phenotype refers to body composition as such. So then if we look at the mother's exposure to other environmental factors, I've already alluded you to these, but just to give you a list there, you can then see that apart from the lack of nutrition that the mother experiences, whatever else she is exposed to while pregnant then has a very critical impact on the fetal development, which is then also associated with an increased risk of non-communicable diseases. So in summary, after this morning's presentation, I just wanted to wrap this up to just remind you that if we then have environmental factors at the top, for instance, the mother is exposed to undernutrition, severe physiological as well as physical stress and infection, and we follow this arrow right down. I apologize, I just had a click there. And we follow this right down to the fetus. We then see that there are changes in growth. In other words, we might end up with a low birth weight infant, changes in organ structure, cell numbers, gene expression, and then also neuroendocrine functions. And we referred there to, for instance, insulin resistance, and then, of course, metabolism. And that then feeds through to adult disease. So that is just to give you a synopsis of what we've covered this morning. So what can we do to prevent this whole scenario? Primary is to reduce the prevalence of poverty for obvious reasons, to improve people's living standards and health outcomes, their risk for malnutrition, infection, disease, especially crucial for women of childbearing age, investing in nutrition programs to improve not only the access and availability of food, but the affordability of nutritious foods. And unfortunately, in South Africa, a lot of the more nutritious foods are expensive. And it's very often the not so nutritious foods that are more affordable. And then, of course, primary is also educating mothers, and not only mothers, but the community at large, regarding the importance of nutrition as well as physical activity. And the most effective ways in bringing about change is to use mass media for the general public, because in that way you get community buy-in for what should be implemented and what is conducive to optimal health. And then it's very important to also integrate messages like these regarding nutrition and physical activity and the importance thereof into subjects, for instance, like the science syllabi for primary and secondary school children, because the child is then exposed to information that the child can then take home and share with the parents, and hopefully then that will also result in better buy-in from the parents as well. And then just to wrap up on a few preventative measures, it's very important to promote breastfeeding and healthy infant and young child feeding practices, because we don't want to now expose the already stressed fetus to inappropriate feeding practices from the moment it's born. And then also very important to improving practices as well as access to water, sanitation, and hygiene, and then supporting strategies to reduce smoking and alcohol consumption, because they are strongly linked with the development of non-communicable diseases of lifestyle. And then also important is to address gender inequality by empowering women to make better decisions for themselves, their families, and their children. And this is especially important in a household where, for instance, the mother doesn't have much say in how the available income is being spent. So by empowering women, they will hopefully be in a better position to take care not only of themselves, but also of their offspring. And I thank you very, very much for joining us this morning. If you want any further contact and advice or input, you'll see their contact numbers for staff at Extended Learning. And then last but not least, this is just to give you an idea of upcoming webinars that are offered free of charge by Extended Learning. So thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Yes, and thank you, Suna, for presenting this morning. I do have a few questions coming in, so do keep them coming in. In the background, I'm just going to launch the poll, but I'm first going to go to one of the raised hands, and this is by Somaya. She's had her hand up since you started the 1,000-day slide, so I'm going to allow her to talk and ask her question. Just check if your microphone is unmuted, Somaya. I'll give Samaya a minute, and maybe before we have one question in the Q&A from Lindiwe. Can impaired brain development be permanent, i.e. extend into adulthood, meaning that the cognitive abilities cannot be restored, improved through better nutrition later on?
Yes, indeed, for sure. And that is why it's so crucial for pregnant women to get the care that they deserve from both a nutritional point of view as well as an emotional point of view. Because unfortunately, these changes are permanent. And yes, you can stimulate the infant and young child at birth, but if there is a level of impairment in brain development that occurred in utero, that unfortunately cannot be altered. So yes, it's very important to be aware of that. I hope it answers your question.
Okay, thanks. Suna, there isn't any more questions at the moment, and I see Samaya has lowered her hand. Yeah, so that's it for now. If anybody has any further questions for us or for Suna, you're welcome to send your questions through when we send out the email later today with the video. But I don't know if you can just put up that last slide, Suna, for the upcoming webinars. Before I end off, I just want to say thank you to Suna for sharing with us today. And we look forward to your final webinar, which is taking place next week. So thank you for this thought-provoking information that you have shared with us. And I'm sure we've all got a better understanding of the various mentioned diseases. But as I did say, the video and the slides will be available on the UEL website, and we'll be sending this link out once it is ready. Thank you to all our attendees for joining us today and making this webinar a success. Do take note of the upcoming webinars that are on the slide now, and do RSVP to secure your place. So just next week on Tuesday, we have our facilitators Liz and Julie continuing with their series on resilience through mindfulness, and this will be part 3 on compassion. And then next week, Thursday, Suna will be joining us again for a presentation on health and well-being, the role of nutrition and lifestyle during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. And this will be quite relevant with the progress to level 3 next week, as well as the return to school of our grade 7s and grade 12s. So we do look forward to that one. So we also have some of our online courses that we are offering for free during the lockdown period. So you're welcome to go on our website and take a look at those. We are offering our own courses as well as partnering with others in order to provide access. So visit our website on www.ukznextendedlearning.com to see what we have on offer. Otherwise, we hope that you enjoyed this session. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.